Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber. Today, we are taking a look at one of the most controversial questions in Warhammer 40k lore. Is the Imperium of Man Fascist? Now I know Arch made a video about this, and while I have some issues with his analysis that we'll discuss a little later in my video, I wanted to say his method of analysis was excellent. He looked back at the historical data, he found a definition, he examined the Imperium to see if it fit that definition. This is how analysis should be done. His video deserves a view, and I will link it down below. Also, just be aware that YouTube automates whether content is advertiser friendly, so even though I'm trying to take an academic look at fascism and the Imperium, there are some words and names that I just can't say, especially a certain German chancellor from the 30s. So before we get deep into my issues with Arch, let's look first for a workable definition of fascism. And as Arch pointed out, there's over 20 definitions on Wikipedia. Now, not all of them are created equal, however. For example, the Soviet Union and even modern Russian scholars need to create this expansive definition of fascism for propaganda purposes. The USSR needed to perform some serious mental gymnastics in order to describe as fascists a coalition of multi-party electoral republics that made up their rival NATO. Some NATO countries even had actual socialists winning elections. Even in modern times, Ukrainian separatists and their Russian allies in the Donbas region propagandize that the forces of the legitimate government of Ukraine, a republic with free and largely fair elections, as fascist puppets of the United States. This is an especially weird allegation given that the United States literally had a president get impeached over his inability to make the Ukraine's government do what he wanted. In fact, defining fascism is actually so tough that even the fascists themselves realized that it was almost impossible. Speaking in 1938, Spanish fascist leader Francisco Franco said, quote, "Fascism presents, wherever it manifests itself, characteristics which are varied to the extent that countries and national temperaments vary. It is essentially a defensive reaction of the organism, a manifestation of the desire to live, of the desire not to die, which at certain times seizes a whole people. So each people reacts in its own way, according to its conception of life. Our rising here has a Spanish meaning. What can it have in common with German fascism, which was, above all, a reaction against the state of things created by defeat and by the abdication and the despair that followed it?" Despite this confusion, there are some scholars whose work on defining fascism is accessible and detailed enough to be helpful and broad enough that it can be actually used to assess our own Imperium of Man. Of those that I looked at, I found the best to be Stanley G. Payne's. Payne is best known as a historian of fascist Spain. His view of fascism involves looking at three dimensions: the negations, ideology and goals, and style and organization. So, moving on to Payne's three dimensions, let's do a little analysis. The easiest of the three is the negations, and that holds that fascists exist in opposition to liberalism, communism, and traditional conservatism. Well, what does Payne mean by this exactly? Well, liberalism is a moral philosophy based on things like governing by consent, tolerance, and embracing the different aspects of human beings. This can include some versions of things like feminism, anti-racism, religious tolerance. It also emphasizes individuals' rights like freedom of speech, private property, equality under the law, and a free press. Fascists stand against liberalism because it's incompatible with a fundamental fascist view that a nation's strength is a function of its unity. The idea that a single state can be strong while containing people who have different religions, cultures, racial or ethnic makeups, even different languages, is anathema to a fascist. even more so, the idea that a single person's right to, say, private property or free speech supersede the desires of the state is a total inversion of fascist ideology. Fascists' anti-communism is almost self-explanatory. Communism, of course, seeks to abolish the state and establish common ownership of the means of production and the elimination of social classes. Fascism is incompatible with communism because it places the well-being and importance of the nation and the state above any individual's needs. Traditional conservatism is a little harder to define, but in the context that Paine is describing it, it seems to be a respect for tradition and traditional institutions. Fascism rejects this because traditions and institutions outside of the cult of the state cannot exist since they divert from national unity. An example might be something like a strong independent church or religious body, or an organization like the Freemasons. Now, does the Imperium of Man meet Paine's requirements for negations? The Imperium certainly is anti-liberalism, since it would never consider an individual human to possess any meaningful rights at all, least of all free speech or freedom of religion. While it may tolerate linguistic and ethnic diversity, for example, it allows the Mechanicum to exist despite the AdMech identifying as toaster Americans. However, in the 41st millennium, if the Imperium was to come across another human planet engaged in the cybernetic augmentation, but didn't have that special carve-out exception from the Emperor himself, you could be pretty sure that those guys are getting purged. As soon as the Imperium makes sure that their planet doesn't have an STC lying around. Is the Imperium anti-communist? Well, this is a little tough, since the only communists in Warhammer are the space communists, and they don't even come close to meeting the definition of communism themselves. If the Imperium discovered a human world, let's say, that was run on communist principles, would the Imperium care? Probably not, as long as the world paid their taxes. But, of course, paying taxes to a state is not very communist at all. And you can bet that if the communist world decided they needed to spread communism across the Imperium, the Empire of Man would have them eating bolter rounds before you can say, workers of the Imperium unite. Anti-conservatism is even tougher since the Imperium's been under its current regime for millennia. However, we know that during the Unification Wars, the Emperor purged all sorts of old institutions, notably other states and religions. I think that Big E's seething hatred of religion qualifies as being anti-conservative. While other old institutions are permitted to exist in some form, like the Knight Houses, they generally have to serve the interests of the state. Of course, real-world fascists like Franco's Spain integrated the church into their fascist order, but like in the Imperium, the church had to toe the line and carry the state's ideological water, or else. So let's move on to fascists' ideology and goals, the next dimension that Paine discusses. Paine's fascist goals and ideology include, quote, espousal of an idealist, vitalist, voluntaristic philosophy, normally involving the attempt to realize a new, modern, self-determined, and secular culture. So this basically means that the fascists are seeking to realize a visionary ideal society, which is more vigorous and revitalized than the previous one. But it's a simultaneously modern society, not religious, and reflects the nation-state as a whole, the nation-state's people determining its path. This actually matches the Emperor's vision to a T. He wanted to revitalize humanity's interstellar empire while also creating a brand new type of secular state free from the forces of chaos and allowing the human race to determine its own fate, not be subordinated to AI or Xenos. So overall, I would say, yeah, check. The Imperium meets this requirement. Paine's next goal is, quote, the creation of a new nationalist authoritarian state, not based on traditional principles or models. In the Imperium's case, the nation is humanity under the emperor, and the emperor's new regime is definitely authoritarian and definitely nationalist, which in this context would mean something like pro-human, anti-Xeno. But compared to mankind's previous stellar empire, Big E's model of governance is weird and definitely not traditional. So we'll say check. Paine's next requirement, quote, organization of a new, highly regulated, multi-class, integrated national economic structure. Multi-class, check. The Imperium is stratified at basically every level. Highly regulated, oh yeah. I mean, changing the oil on your car is a religious ceremony in the Empire of Man. Integrated, I would say so, since most worlds are expected to produce specifically what the Imperium wants, and their macroeconomy is dictated to them by Terra. Next requirement, positive evaluation of or willingness to use violence and war. Okay, guys, I'm just gonna have you guys let me know in the comments if you think the Imperium is a willingness to use violence and war. Next up, the goal of empire, expansion, or radical change in the nation's relationship with other powers. Oh yeah, I'd say the Imperium wants to drastically change its relationship with other races, i.e., crush them. So, I think it's fair to say that the Imperium is batting a 5 out of 5 on ideology and goals, and at least 2 out of 3 on the fascist negations. So let's look at the last dimension, style and organization. So the first vibe that Paine talks about is, quote, attempted mass mobilization with militarization of political relationships and style with the goal of a single mass party militia. So the Imperium, I think, does, or at least would like to have all its armed forces under their command. And certainly all the armed forces are more or less indoctrinated and mobilized in the cult of the Emperor. Most, if not all, political relationships between the High Lords of Terra and their subordinate worlds and organizations are pretty much militarized. So I would go ahead and check this as a yes. Next up, emphasis on aesthetic structure of meetings, symbols, political liturgy, stressing emotional and mystical aspects. I don't know, guys. Does the Imperium love symbols that stress the mystical aspects of things? You tell me. Next up, extreme stress on the masculine principle and male dominance while espousing a strongly organic view of society. Well, this is tough, but the Emperor literally did use the powers of the warp to make his Primarchs, and he still didn't think to use any of his magical gene editing to make even one female Primarch, and therefore there are no female Astartes and no female Custodians. In fact, in almost every single unit in the Imperium, save for the cannon fodder, gender is segregated. Even the Sisters of Silence are women only, despite the fact that men are perfectly capable of being blanks. The sisters, the Imperium decided, have to be gender segregated because girls and boys can't have the same clubhouse. Of course, the Inquisition is mixed gender. And so I know this one is controversial, but given that the Emperor, his Primarchs, his Custodians, and his finest warriors, the Astartes, are all dudes, I'm going to call this a yes. Next up, exaltation of youth above other phases of life, emphasizing the conflict of the generations, at least in affecting the initial political transition. This is interesting. So while the Emperor was all about the rebirth of mankind's empire, he actually seems to have emphasized his agelessness and his wisdom from experience. So I'm actually going to give this a no. And the last one, specific tendency toward authoritarian, charismatic, personal style of command, whether or not the command is to some degree initially elective. This is true, and it's even true even given that Jimmy Space is off napping in his room. I mean, look at every Primarch leading their legions from the front with their flaming sword in hand. Every chapter master has an epic hero, and it's pretty clear that the Imperium's mythos emphasizes this individual charismatic hero at a level that's almost strategically detrimental. But let's be honest, it lets GW sell some super dope minis at really inflated prices. So, on the fascist vibe scale, we are going to give the Imperium 4 out of 5. Before we take a look at the ultimate answer, is the Imperium fascist, I wanted to discuss a little bit some of my critiques of Arch's analysis in his definition of fascism. The definition he used, Mussolini's, quote, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That sounds like a really clean, easy definition, but for someone who complained that the other definitions were too generic, he picked maybe the most generic of all. And let's take a look at a regime who we all agree was definitely fascist. Germany under that prick with the dumb mustache. Now, Arch cites the extensive self-rule of subsectors within the Imperium as proof that things exist outside the state in the Imperium. But lower levels of government bureaucracy, they are the state. Even in Germany during the interwar and World War II period, they had the Reichsstatthalter, or Reich governors. They were given the task of overseeing the fulfillment of the Chancellor's political guidelines within the states of Germany. And indeed, the law enabled them to have almost complete authority over their states. These governors could appoint and dismiss their minister-president, dissolve state parliament, call new elections, issue new laws, appoint or dismiss state agents and judges. Yeah, these guys had almost complete autonomy. Delegation of authorities is something that all states do to some degree, and have always done. And while some institutions, such as the church and maybe some private enterprises, existed sort of outside the state in Germany, their existence doesn't disprove that Germany was fascist, any more than the existence of the Tau disproves chaos. Arch's next argument that the AdMech is also against the state is also really strange, since the Imperium isn't governed by Terra, it's governed by the High Council of Terra, whose membership literally includes the Fabricator General of Mars. So it really isn't fair to say that the AdMech is outside the state. While the AdMech has their own interests they pursue, that doesn't make them outside of or against the state. Again, in 1930s and 40s Germany, at the levels below the Chancellor, factions competed against each other for favor, resources, and power. The Big H's contradictory orders, his playing of favorites, his willingness to cross or overlap authorities meant that these factions and ruling organizations pulled against one another constantly. And this wasn't a bug of the system, it's actually a feature of authoritarian rule. Finally, Arch cites the Inquisition and other large bureaucracies as proof that the Imperium has nothing against the state, but secret police are a staple of every fascist country. And I don't need to remind you about, Big H's creepy guys in trench coats. They also had autonomy similar to the Inquisition of the Imperium. So, as we see from even the most quintessential definition of fascism, 1930s and 40s Germany also manages to fail Arch's definition. So what about our definition? Well, it's pretty clear that the Imperium definitely does meet most of Payne's requirements. Where it sort of gets a little wonky, it does so only because it's set in space in a far future. It's not because the Imperium has some moral upstanding quality. Therefore, we can only conclude that the Imperium is indeed fascist, and maybe we can hyphenate it to reflect the facts that there's some strange aspects to being an interstellar empire. We can call it neo-fascism, or follow the naming convention of everything else in the Imperium and call it space fascism. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching, and special thanks to my patrons, right? You guys make it possible for me to make videos like this because it's a little advertiser risky, so knowing I have you guys at my back makes a huge difference. Be sure, of course, to follow me on Instagram, check out my second channel, the links are down below, check out my merch store, and I will see you guys next time.